Hello, and welcome to our second lesson in the in the story of Ruth. It is a four-act play, and we are in the second act of this four-act play, or this four-scene play. We're in the second scene of the play, and the story gets better. We have a little more interesting things that happen today. Just to kind of bring you up to speed, before I give us an opening prayer, but just to give you a little up to speed here, is that Naomi had a husband named Elimelech and two sons, and they headed off to Moab when Bethlehem, the city of bread, had a famine. They moved to the land of Moab, where they were accepted, and they set up a household, and eventually Elimelech died, and Naomi was left as a widow. But while they were there, while they were still living there, the two sons of Naomi and Elimelech they got married to Ruth and Orpah. Well, after everybody died, Naomi decided she needed to go back to her homeland, back to Bethlehem. She heard that there was no longer a famine and that she could return. And so she started to head back toward Bethlehem, toward Judah, her hometown. And along the way, both Ruth and Orpah wanted to stay with her. She asked them 3 times to turn back, which is custom. That is part of the way that they do things, especially those that are going to try to become a Jew, is that the rabbis ask you 3 times to turn back, and each time they ask with more vehemence, with more purposefulness, to try to persuade you to change your mind and go back to being what you were and not proceed with becoming a Jew. Orpah goes back on the second, the second time that Naomi asked them to go back. Orpah turns back and she goes back to her homeland, back to Moab. But Ruth doubles down on it and says, "Where you go, I will go. I will go wherever you go. And so your God will be my God, your people my people." And so they head on and they head back to Bethlehem, where they establish a residence there, and they start living in Bethlehem. Let us pray. Most gracious and loving God, watch over us today. Guide our minds, guide our spirits, and guide our wisdom. Help us find a full understanding in your word. Help us discern what it means for us and how we can incorporate what we learn, what we hear from your word into our daily lives. And in all things, we call on your name to bless us and to keep us. And we praise your name, and we praise your Son, who sacrificed himself for us. And in all things, we thank you and we give you praise. Amen. So, picking up now with Ruth chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. Now, Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The servant, who was in charge of the reapers, answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers.' So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting, even for a moment." So we find out as our as the second scene of our story comes, we see that Naomi knows that she has a kinsman in Bethlehem. That this kinsman is on her husband's side. We also find out that he's rich, that he was a wealthy man from the family of Elimelech, and his name is Boaz. Ruth then, and I want you to note here, it says, is the Ruth the Moabite. And so she's still being listed as a foreigner. She says to Naomi that she wants to go in the field and glean among the grain. And and she wants to do this behind someone who maybe will find favor with her, will find her in favor. And so Naomi said, well, go ahead, go do that. So she goes, and she comes and she starts gleaning in the fields behind the reapers. Now, this is acceptable. I have to be honest with you, though, if you go back to the Jewish text of this, the Jewish Bible, you'll find that the story, the commentary on this, or the story, kind of leads us to believe that, yes, she's gleaning behind the reapers, but she's actually doing it in the field instead of along the edges of the field. So she's not gleaning in the right way, but she is gleaning in the field behind the workers. What is she supposed to be doing is gleaning on the edge of the field. Is that the gleaners come along and they glean, or the gleaners come along and they glean, and then those that are picking up the scraps, which is what it is she's going to be picking up the scraps, those that are left over from the main gleaners. And the gleaners are supposed to leave the edges, the very edges of the fields, to be gleaned by those that need it. And it's usually the widows, orphans, and those that are really poor are allowed to come along and glean along the edges. But the story presents this to us in the language and the verbiage of this is that she's actually not doing it in the right way, is that she's gleaning from the center of the field right behind the main gleaners, which is technically not correct. It's not supposed to be that way. But that plays into the story as we move forward. So we find this out, and it's interesting too, is that we have the phrase "as it happens," or "as it happened," which is also translated coincidentally. But what's interesting to me is that the story presents it this way, that it's just coincidence, but the coincidence in this is tongue-in-cheek. That this is actually God's doing. God is working in the background of this. I want you to note here that all through the story, all through the book of Ruth, that God is mentioned and God is brought up and God is part of the story, but God is not directly in the story, as in God never speaks, God never takes a direct hand, but he's in the background. God is in the background paying attention to what's going on, but is not an active participant in what's going on. And that's a little different in this story than in most of our biblical stories, in that God is not an active player, but he's a player, but he's not an active player in the story. So Boaz comes from Bethlehem. Maybe he came from his house. He lives in Bethlehem. He's come out to his fields to check in on the reapers, to find out how things are going. How is the harvest going? And he comes up, and we have to note that Boaz is a proper Jew in everything he does. He comes in, and the first thing he says to his servants, these are reapers, these are people who work for him, is, "The Lord be with you." These are opening words that we say right here in church. The Lord be with you. And the congregation is supposed to respond with, "and also with you," which is kind of what their response is. He says, "The Lord be with you," and their response is, "The Lord bless you." Also with you. And so in every single way, as we see Boaz, he is a strict adherence to the rules of the law as they're interpreted through a kind eye, a gentle eye. So he comes up and he tells his servants, "The Lord bless you, the Lord be with you," and they answered, "The Lord bless you too. Shalom," and shalom back to you. And as he's there, maybe even as he was approaching, he noticed Ruth working the field. And maybe what he noticed was that she wasn't working in the right field. She wasn't working in the proper place. She wasn't along the edge, but instead she was following behind, right up there with the reapers. So she was acting more as one of the workers than she was one of the poor gleaning on the edge. And so maybe we see in the story that Boaz noticed this. He noticed her. And so he comes up and he says, who is this young woman? Who does this woman belong to? Who among all of these out here does she belong to? And the answer is, well, she's the Moabite woman that came with Naomi, and how she's been taking care of Naomi. So the servant lets Boaz know who this woman is, that she is the Moabite that came with Naomi from the country of Moab. And when she came, she asked that she could please glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. And so she actually asked permission to do what she is doing. And she's came, and she's been doing that since early this morning. She's been on her feet working nonstop since early this morning. She hasn't rested for even a moment. That tells us quite a bit about Ruth. And Boaz, seeing this dedication to work, this absolute dedication, would have seen this, recognized it, and would have thought of this as being very special. Very special. So picking up now with verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eye on the field that is being reaped, and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then she fell prostrate, with her face to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Then she said, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants." So Boaz now is speaking directly to Ruth, and he tells her, don't go to another field. In fact, stay with this one. Don't leave this field. Keep closer to my young women that are gleaning the edges also. Keep close to them. Keep your eye on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them, because I've ordered them not to bother you. So whether you're gleaning in the field or gleaning on the edge of the field, nobody's going to bother you, and you can do as you wish. In fact, when you get thirsty, I want you to go to the drinking vessels that the young men have drawn and drink your fill. Boaz, in every way, is in this whole statement of what he's doing here is against the norm, but it's showing grace and compassion for a foreigner. Boaz, in every way, lives into the ideal of what it means to be a good Jew, of following the rules, treating a foreigner as if they belonged there, caring for someone who is in need, showing compassion for someone who is in need. Boaz is that perfect Jew. In every way, he's a perfect God-fearing person who does those things that are right. Ruth recognizes this, and she's amazed. Her statement tells us that she's surprised by this. That, what have I done? She falls prostrate to the ground in front of him and says, what have I done to deserve this? What have I done to find favor in your sight, for you to take note of me and allow me, a foreigner, to be at peace with your people. Boaz going, but I've heard about you. I've heard what you've done. I heard you forsake your family to come with Naomi. I heard about all this and how you have taken care of Naomi. You've come to a people that you don't know. And I think God's going to reward you for that. Adonai is going to reward you for that. The God of Israel, under whose wing you have found refuge, or who you've called for refuge. You've come for refuge under the wings of God. That phrasing of that is such a beautiful statement. It says that it's that brooding hen concept, that the wings come out and the hens, the little chicks all go under the wing. This phrase, though, I want you to realize, and we need to hold on to this, is that under whose wing you have come to find refuge, or come to refuge. That plays into the next scene, which is next week's story, scene 3. We're still in scene 2, and so I want you to know that under the wings of God for protection, for refuge, that comes into play. Phrasing of that comes into play in Act 3, and I'll remind you of that when it comes up. How that in the future and this now are connected, and I'll bring that to you when it comes. Her response is that, may I continue to find favor in your sight. I hope to please you in every way. My Lord, if you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I'm not one of your servants. You have blessed me, even though I am not, you haven't required to. I'm not one of your servants. I don't work for you. I'm a foreigner, and yet you've comforted me, you've blessed me, you've spoken kindly to me, even though you have no responsibility to do that whatsoever. That's in her mind. But the reality of it is that Boaz is acting well inside the norms of his culture, as he should be. The ideals of his culture. Just like we as a country have ideals about how we should live with each other, we have ideals about freedom and social discourse and how we act as a nation. We have an ideal of how we should be. Boaz lives into the ideal of what his people should be. Picking up now with verse 14. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of this bread, and dip your morsel in the sour wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, "Let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So it came around to mealtime. It's middle afternoon. This is the afternoon meal break, and Boaz asks her to come over to eat some of the bread there, and to dip the bread into the sour wine. This is the stuff, this is the meal that was actually reserved for the workers. And so she's been invited in to eat with the regular workers. And it would be a good meal. He also gives her an extra meal. He gives her some parched grain that she can eat also. So he gives her a little extra. Well, she eats until she's satisfied. And she even eats to the point where she actually has some left over. She's been given more. She's been given an abundant amount. So she goes up, and she gets up, and she goes back out to glean. And before the young men, all the other gleaners can go out there, Boaz instructs them that let her glean even among the standing grain. Now, this is, she's already been kind of doing this, following behind the gleaners, not exactly in the standing grain, but right behind them, gleaning right behind them, which is, it's not wrong, but it's not exactly the way it's supposed to be done. But now she's been giving actually instructions that even if she is to move into the grain, the standing grain, and glean even there. And he further instructs those workers then that every once in a while I want you to go ahead and pull some of the stuff that you've already gleaned, pull out some of that, and I want you to leave some bundles for her to pick up. And when she does that, don't rebuke her. Don't give her a hard time. If she moves into the main grain and reaps from there, don't give her a hard time. It's okay. I'm giving her permission to do that. Picking up now with verse 17. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and came into the town. And her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Then she took out and gave her what she had left over after she herself had been satisfied. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay close by my servants until they have finished all my harvest.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is better, my daughter, that you go out with this young woman. Otherwise you might be bothered in another field." So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests. And she lived with her mother-in-law. Well, so Ruth goes back out into the field and goes and continues to work, and she works until evening. She then goes to the threshing floor, and she beats out what she has gleaned and collects it all up, and she collects more than about an ephah, which is actually quite a bit. It's several days' worth of bread or of grain. This time it's barley. This is still the barley harvest. Well, she picks it all up, and she comes back into town, and her mother-in-law sees how much she had gleaned and is amazed by this. She also gives to Naomi her leftover lunch. Remember the parched grain that she had been given along with her meal. She wasn't able to finish it all. It was more than she could eat. She brings that home as leftovers, and Naomi gets that as a meal, which again which was enough. It was plentiful amount. We need to recognize again that, and I said this in the last chapter in the first section, but again, the story of Ruth is a story that moves from empty to plenty, or from plenty to empty to plenty. But it's a contrast between being empty and being plenty, of having plenty. And here there was plentiful amount of grain, of the parched grain left over, that was even enough for Naomi to have a blessing from this and to eat from this. Naomi then asks her, "Well, where did you glean today? What and where have you worked? And blessed be the man who noticed you." Naomi must understand that something has happened, because Ruth has brought not only an ephah of grain, but also meal, the parched grain the parched grain that she had received for lunch. And so when she brings all of this, Naomi knows that something has happened, that some male must have blessed her, because otherwise she wouldn't have gotten all of this stuff. This is a male-dominated world. And so she even knows, "Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So Ruth goes on and tells her the rest of the story, that she met the man who is named Boaz, and that's whose field I gleaned in today. Naomi looks over at Ruth and says, "Oh my goodness, blessed be he by the Lord, that his kindness, not only to the living but also to the dead." By recognizing Ruth and Naomi and blessing them with the gifts of the barley and the parched grain and all of that, Boaz is showing kindness to someone who is a widow. He knows she's a widow. He also knows that Ruth is a widow. So Boaz, in this kindness, is he's not forsaking the living or the dead in this. And Naomi recognizes this as this man is a blessed person. This is a really good person. Naomi also recognizes that Boaz is a relative, that he is a relative of Elimelech, her husband. And so she informs Ruth of this, is that this man is one of our nearest kin. Ruth then goes on to explain, he even said to me, stay close to my servants until they have finished all the harvest. He says, so stay close and continue to work there. Naomi responds, man, it is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women. It's better that you do that. And that way, it's better that you go ahead and stick with this plan here. Go with the young women into Boaz's field. You will be protected. If you go into another field, you might not be protected. And the men of the other field may start bothering you. You are a Moabite. You're not an Israelite. And so these non-Boaz people, these men who in the time of the judges, again, remember where the story takes time in the time of the judges is that all men did as they saw fit in their own eyes. And so this is kind of a warning is, otherwise these other men may bother you. And so you stick close to Boaz and the women that Boaz protects, his household. So that's exactly what Ruth does. She stays close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning through the rest of the barley harvest season and on into the wheat harvest. Remember, I told you that this story takes place over 7 weeks. And so it starts at the beginning of the barley harvest and it ends at the end of the wheat harvest. And during that entire time, she continued to live with her mother-in-law, Naomi. Well, that's our story for today. Next week, we will pick up with chapter 3. Chapter 3 is the third scene, the third act in the story, and most of that story takes place on the threshing floor. So I look forward to that. We see the next phase of this story, Act 3, next week, as this beautiful story of love and compassion and God's blessing continues. My friends, I thank you for coming. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. And all of God's people said,